Hey, everybody, I'm here. So glad that you're joining me today as we continue our series, How to Hold On to Your Faith When You Are Tired. Last week in part 1, we talked about what faith really is. We learned that it's not this perfect picture of belief that never doubts or wavers, but it's this messy, imperfect journey of trusting God, even when things don't make sense. We also saw in part 2 how Elijah, this prophet from the Old Testament, found himself at a point where he wanted to give up. He was tired of fighting for God. He was tired of being threatened by Queen Jezebel, and so he just wanted to quit. But God didn't call him in a mighty wind or in a powerful earthquake, but in a still, small voice. He met him when he was at his lowest point. And today, in part 3, we're going to meet another person who teaches us how to fight through our weariness and hold on to our faith no matter what. A few weeks ago, my family and I took a mission trip down to the Dominican Republic. It was amazing. Not only did we get to help build houses for families who don't have homes, but we got to share the gospel with people who had never heard it before. The team that we went with does these incredible Jesus film screenings. They'll set up a big screen and a projector, and they'll show the Jesus film in the local language. And then afterwards, there will be an altar call. People will come forward, and they'll put their faith in Jesus Christ for the first time. Now, one day while we were out doing construction, we started talking about the Great Commission. You know, Jesus' last words in the Bible in Matthew 28-19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. My son, who was 6 at the time, piped up and said, you know, that verse makes me sad because most of the world has never heard the gospel and most of us aren't doing anything about it. Now, his comment stuck with me. And I think sometimes when it comes to our faith, we can feel like we're not doing enough, like we need to do more. And in today's passage, I think we're gonna see that even though Paul faced hardship after hardship, betrayal after betrayal, he never gave up. He held on to his faith. And we're gonna learn 3 principles from him that will help us do the same. Acts chapter 14. Verses 8-20. Then he and Barnabas boldly went into the synagogue. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue came up to them and said, you have the words of eternal life. Have come to us. And when the Jews of the city heard this, both the synagogue and the Gentiles, they came together and pressed upon them to hear these words. But when they had appointed a day for him to speak, the Jews assembled and contradicted everything that Paul said. And so they both opposed him and mocked him and threw off his cloak and his outer garment, and they wanted to stone him. But when the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, heard of it, they went back to the city, not to Antioch, but to Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe, preaching the gospel from city to city, and confirming the word with signs which followed. After they had preached the gospel to that city, and had taught many disciples, they were also persecuted by the Jews there. So they shook off their dust against them, and came to Athens. There they spent some time sharing their faith. And as they were doing so, they encountered a group of philosophers named the Areopagus. And Paul began to preach to them about Jesus. But they mocked him, so he left and found a group of women who believed and gathered with them. Some of the men joined them, but the majority remained unconvinced. The first thing I want you to notice about Paul in this passage is that he was willing to start over. Verse 8 says, then he and Barnabas boldly went into the synagogue. Now, in case you're not familiar with synagogues, they're places of worship for Jewish people. It's kind of similar to a church building for Christians. And Paul and Barnabas, they weren't scared to walk right into the synagogue and teach people about Jesus. They boldly went in. But verse 19 tells us that they didn't stay. After the Jews heard what Paul had to say, they tried to kill him. So Paul and Barnabas, they didn't try to defend themselves. They didn't try to fight the accusations. They simply shook off their dust and they moved on to the next city. They were willing to start over. Sometimes in our faith, we can get comfortable. Maybe we've been going to the same church for years, and we know everybody, and it's familiar and comfortable. Or maybe we're in a small group, and we've been meeting in the same home for a long time, and it feels safe and comfortable. Well, sometimes God calls us to step outside of our comfort zone. Sometimes He might call us to find a new church, to join a different ministry, to reach a new people group. And we can resist that. We can fight that. We can argue with God about it. Or we can trust that God is leading us in a different direction for His purposes, and we can follow Him even if it means starting over. The second thing I want you to notice about Paul is that he endured opposition. Look at verse 19 again. It says, "But when the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, heard of it, they went back to the city, not to Antioch, but to Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe, preaching the gospel from city to city, and confirming the word with signs which followed. After they had preached the gospel to that city, and had taught many disciples, they were also persecuted by the Jews there. So they shook off their dust against them, and came to Athens, there to spend some time sharing their faith." Now, it doesn't say here that they preached the gospel everywhere they went, but it does tell us that they were willing to go to difficult places. They were willing to face opposition. For Paul, this wasn't just a mission trip. This was his life. He was constantly traveling, constantly planting churches, constantly facing opposition, constantly being rejected, constantly being attacked, constantly enduring hardship. And yet, he didn't quit. I think sometimes we might be willing to endure opposition for a little bit, maybe for a month or two, but we don't think we could endure it for a lifetime. But Paul teaches us that we can. The Greek translation of the word endure in this passage actually means to persevere. So Paul teaches us that we can persevere through persecution. We can persevere through opposition. We can persevere through difficult times. It's not easy, but we can do it. The third thing I want you to notice about Paul is that he never let rejection stop him. Acts chapter 14, verses 21 to 22. After they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many disciples, they were also persecuted by the Jews there. So they shook off their dust against them and came to Athens. There they spent some time sharing their faith. And as they were doing so, they encountered a group of philosophers named the Areopagus. And Paul began to preach to them about Jesus, but they mocked him. So he left and found a group of women who believed and gathered with them. Some of the men joined them, but the majority remained unconvinced. Now, when Paul arrived in Athens, he went to the Areopagus, this group of philosophers, and he shared the gospel with them, but they mocked him. Imagine having the courage to share your faith with people, and they mock you. You can't get much worse than that. But Paul didn't let it stop him. I think sometimes when we're rejected, it's easy to feel discouraged. We start to wonder, am I saying the wrong things? Am I not saying the right things? Should I tone it down next time? Maybe I shouldn't share my faith. Maybe I should just keep it to myself. Paul, however, he didn't do that. He simply moved on. He found a group of women who were open to the message. And the lesson I take away from that is that we should never let rejection stop us. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it stings. Yes, it's discouraging. But we can't let it stop us. We have to remember that our job is to be obedient, not necessarily to be successful. Our job is to preach the gospel to all the world, not to see how many people accept it. Our job is to share our faith, not to worry about whether people believe. See, if we focus on our success rate, if we focus on the numbers, then we'll be discouraged. But if we focus on obedience, if we focus on Jesus and what He wants us to do, then we'll be encouraged. I hope that helps. Stay with us for part 3. Paul beaten, chained, but still believing. Coming next, we'll follow the journey of a man who was shipwrecked, stoned, and imprisoned, yet never let go of faith. Subscribe, stay encouraged, and remember, you don't stand alone. The same God who gave Paul strength